Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeremy Siskin, and I'm joined today by my friend Danny Ziemann, who's coming to us all the way from Vienna, Austria.
Hey,
Um,
everybody.
and the reason that I've invited Danny on today is that he's a great bassist and educator. And I realized that I've never really had any formal training in coming up with bass lines. Yet I've been teaching this for a little while in terms of playing bass lines on the piano. So I wanted to kind of run a BS test for myself, and I'm going to share with you how I like to teach bass lines. Um, and at every turn, I'm going to ask Danny to call BS. And Danny, I'm going to ask you to not pull any punches. I want to learn something today, okay? I want you to give it to me straight. If I'm saying something stupid, please call me out on it so that we can all learn a little something. But first, Danny, do you want to just tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I love this. First off, thank you for inviting me. I mean, it's such a treat to be able to do this. Um, and yeah, so I am a jazz bassist living in Vienna. I do a lot of teaching online, through various programs. I have my First Call Bassist program. I'm like Jeremy, an author of pedagogical materials, and yeah, it's just like one of the greatest joys for me is to really help like musicians of all ages step into their musicianship and like really expand what they're able to do on the instrument in all settings. So yeah, I am a big devotee to the learning process. Um, yeah, I don't know. That's like, I guess the most succinct way to say it. And yeah, again, just a treat to be here with you.
All right, awesome. Okay, so to get started, I first want to talk about the two things that I see pianists getting wrong the most when they try to play bass lines on piano. And the first one is that they tend to play bass lines too high. Um, right, the four strings of the bass, and God, I hope I don't get this wrong, Danny, on the piano, and by the way, the lowest note of the piano on your camera is right here. So the strings of the bass is this low E,
Yeah,
which is the lowest E on the piano, and it goes up in fourths to A, D, and G.
exactly.
So if you're going much above that G, of course it's possible to play higher on the bass, but you're getting out of the sweet spot range of the instrument. So pianists who walk a bass line up here, it's possible, but it's pretty high. And it means you're not going to get as much resonance as you want. And it also means, you're really up close to your chords. So, if I'm walking or, if I'm playing a bass line for the first four measures of Autumn Leaves, I want to be down here. Right? Bass wouldn't technically be able to play this E flat. As a pianist, I don't really mind going below the range of the bass a little bit. If I get all the way down here, it doesn't sound like much. But just, yeah, you want to keep that E and this A and this D kind of in your mind as like, this is the sweet spot for the bass register.
Totally.
Doing okay so far?
No BS. You are right on top of it. It's great.
Okay. And, frequently when we write out bass parts, they're written an octave up from where they would sound. Because it's just kind of a pain in the butt to read a bunch of ledger lines or to read A through B. So whenever you're playing something that maybe is doubling the bass, you might want to think about putting it an octave down so that you're actually in that bass register.
That's absolutely true because especially if you're doubling a line with the bass player, the piano always wins, especially in terms of intonation. So if there's like an octave plus 5 cents between you, then it's so noticeable. So at pitch is all I think always better.
Cool. Okay. Great. So that's the first thing I see pianists getting wrong. Luckily, it's a very easy fix. Move your hand down an octave from where it wants to be. I know some pianists are like scared of this register of the piano. I'm not sure why.
Trauma from
Um,
bass players yelling at them, probably.
could be. That's right. The second thing that I want to make sure people understand is that, from my experience, bass lines on the piano should always be played legato, or just about always. And it's kind of a weird thing because we think about pizzicato being short, and of course, bassists, in the jazz style, are playing pizzicato all the time. Um, but because I think the bass, that sound, resonates for so long, you actually kind of feel a connection. So if you're playing like a bass line in two and you play, this feels very hokey, right? You really want to connect. And this does get difficult as you're starting to play walking bass lines, because it takes some fancy fingering to make sure that all those do connect legato. So I understand why sometimes pianists maybe resist that or have some spaces in there, but I think you really want to make the entire line legato. What do you think? Agree?
100%. Um,
Yes.
the thing where you can start to make choices about articulations, right? I mean, because articulations affect the beginning of the note, but also how much decay there is. Um, if you're playing, if you have to play piano bass lines in like a 1930s Lindy Hop style, for example, or like you're playing Chick Webb tunes, um, that's when you're playing doubled notes with space between each note. But that's stylized. Essentially, the shorter the note, the earlier the era of bass lines.
Interesting.
So legato 100%, and also because if you don't play legato, it can actually obscure the time feel a little bit. Like if your notes don't all decay the same way, then the time
Mm.
can feel very inconsistent. So it's always like it's like dominoes. Your notes generally want to run into one another unless you're making a short note for a stylistic choice.
Got it. Okay, and I want to say I'm going to float something out there, and I want your response to it,
Okay.
which is I've heard both ways about whether you want to accent on two and four, and it seems like the great bass players playing in an ensemble do not put an extra accent on two and four. They play pretty evenly. But I think there are moments if you're not playing with the drummer where you can kind of imply that hi hat with a little accent on two and four. Is that just totally gauche? Is that totally gross from a bassist standpoint if you put a little bit of weight on two and four?
No, I think it's great. You sound like you are a bass player. I mean, everything you're saying is spot on. I mean that's where like if you're getting into bass lines for the first time as a pianist, then I would say in general, anything you can do to make your sound and harmonic choices be the propulsion of swing, like that's
Mm.
great before you start manipulating too many of the accents. Um, Although then you get to a point where, for example, I've some of my favorite bass players play totally straight. Like I think Ron Carter is a great example of someone who kind of plays all of the quarter notes with an even sort of even accent. And then
Mhm.
I took a bass lesson with Dave Holland a couple years ago, and he was like, "Oh, you got to make your bass lines dance." And he was playing. There were a lot of accents, and it was really it was so beautiful. It was so beautiful and so effective, and it had a lot of this shape to it. Um, so I think that ultimately it becomes a stylistic choice, but the bottom line is that it's a choice, right? It's not just a habit of
Mm.
a function of habit, rather.
Right. But I'd say in general, like you listen to Paul Chambers play in the Miles Davis quintet, like it's going to be pretty straight. He's not like really laying out on two and four with a big accent.
Exactly. You might get like a few percent more push on two and four naturally, but
Hmm.
I think in general, keep like especially as you're starting off, keeping it straighter is the way to go in terms of everything has the same velocity. Although you also nailed it. Like when I play in drummerless trios, like if I'm playing in an Oscar Peterson style trio or Nat King
Hmm.
Cole, um, I will actually accent two and four a little bit because it does add propulsion. And when there are no drums, you have to work a bit harder to keep the time moving forward and to give it that lift. So a bit of two and four can actually be very helpful in those moments.
All right. Beautiful. All right. So those are a few things to watch out for in terms of getting started. Now, let's get to, if you wanted to get started playing a bass line, the first thing that I would say, Danny, is that a lot of students want to rush into walking bass lines or bass lines in four. But I'm a big proponent that you should start with bass lines in two first. By the way, just in case anybody isn't sure what these terms mean, baseline in two means that you're dividing the bar in two. So assuming we have a 4/4 bar, we're playing half notes. Versus a 4/4, or sorry, versus a bass line in four or a walking bass, we're going to be dividing the bar into four parts, into quarter notes, and we'll play four quarter notes in the measure. So, do you agree that it's best to start with a bass line in two first?
So personally, when I start, I actually start with four.
Really?
Um, I do, but um, I really think that you can go both. You can totally go both ways with it. Um, what I found just from starting in four is that it gets well, the way that I teach it, I start, having bass players just play open strings and quarter notes just so they can get used to that propulsion or that rhythmic motion in their arms. Um, so in order to develop kind of a driving quarter note pulse, I generally tend to push people into the deep end with walking lines. Um, but for people who don't want to think about as much harmony yet or want to get more command of the half note, then absolutely. Like sometimes I'll start people on in two if walking is too much right off the bat.
Got it. And this might be a difference between bass playing and piano playing because there's two big problems when we start in four with piano playing. The first one is obviously just finding what notes to play for harmony. And there's so many options when you're in four. But then the second one, like I said, is fingering. It does get dicey. And especially if you're coordinating comping or you're coordinating playing a melody with a bass line in four, like that's a lot of coordination to do. It's really hard. Um, so I'm going to start us, considering that probably most people watching my channel are pianists. I'm going to start us in two. And Danny, I'm curious for your feedback. I teach three different options for playing a bass line in two. The first one, I think the most standard one, is playing the root on the downbeat and the fifth of the chord on beat three.
Yeah.
So I've got the first four measures of Autumn Leaves in front of me here. So the first measure would be like C to G, the second measure F to C. And notice on the first chord, I went up to the fifth, and for the second chord, I went from the root down to the fifth. And it's completely okay to do either in order to make a melody. And in fact, if we keep going up, 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 we're going to go climb the keyboard. If we keep going down, 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 we're going to just descend into nothing. The other thing to notice for those of you at home is I'm trying to make connections between the measures. I'm not going right, and we want bass lines to be melodic, right? Not melodies in the way that they're going to be the things that you sing on your drive home, but melodic in that they connect. There's a horizontal line to them as well as just outlining the harmony. Is that right, Danny?
Yeah, totally. And I think the cool thing about at least with from what I understand with my limited piano knowledge, you can most people can generally reach about an octave, right, in their hands. It's kind of maybe an average reach. With bass players, we generally, in any position, we have access to an octave and maybe a bit more. So you don't hear bass players doing large jumps in their bass lines or leaps. Everything kind of stays contained. All of the voice leading stays contained within an octave. So like when you were played the big jump before, it's probably awkward on piano, and it's definitely awkward on bass too.
Got it. So we're the same.
Yeah.
So let me play this. This is roots and fifths. Okay so far?
Yeah. So
all right. Oh, go ahead.
So I'll add one thing, and this is like a very nuanced detail of bass playing. I've got my bass here. May I demonstrate?
Of course.
All right. So if I was playing that bass line, so that's totally possible, but when you jump down a fourth on the bass, what happens is you end up having to use the same fingering, which means that you lose a little bit of sustain. So oftentimes if I'm going from F, like C, going up a fourth or going up a fifth rather, totally fine. But if I'm going, see, there's a little bit of a hiccup in there. So I might actually play F to A to B.
Oh, you're getting a little ahead of me. But,
okay.
But
so,
yes, exactly. But that's really good to know.
Yeah, fourths can be tricky.
That's really interesting. So you got slightly ahead of me because the second thing that I teach is roots and thirds, right? Instead of going to fifth, you play the root on the downbeat and you play the third of the chord. And I think most people watching understand this, but it's not that you choose to do all roots and fifths or all roots and thirds. You can choose some roots and fifths, some roots and thirds. You want to mix it up. You don't want your bass line to be predictable or formulaic. Isn't that right?
Totally.
So, but just, to demonstrate, if I were going to do all roots and thirds, I'd go C to E flat, F to A, B flat to D, E flat to G. And again, you could go up a third or you could go down to the third, which means you're kind of leaping down by a sixth, which is what you were demonstrating
Yeah.
there, right? And I've had some people in classes ask, how do you know whether it's a major or a minor third? And because of the chord, right? You're doing the third of the chord. So does that sound okay?
Yeah, actually, and that's kind of what I default to actually when I'm playing.
Really,
too.
before the
Yes.
roots and fifths. Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. All right, and then the third one might be controversial. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about it. The third thing that I teach, I call it root scoop, and this means that you play the root, of course, on beat one, and then you play a half step leading, either from below or from above to the next bass note. So going from C to F, you could play C, E, or C, G flat, F. What do you think?
So this is yeah. So this well, okay, I will preface my comment with another comment, which is if there was an instrumentalist to be very aware of how this works, I think it's pianists, because you understand the implications of using chromatic passing tones. Bass players who use those, let's say I'm playing C, G flat, F over a nice C minor 7 chord. If I play a G flat, now your entire chord changes function and it sounds different. And bass players often don't consider how all of the harmony changes because we're dealing with one note at a time, or it's not as intuitive to us. So I think for pianists who explore that, maybe there's a bit more awareness of how all of those things are connected. So it's also like Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. As soon as you introduce those half steps, it's a really strong choice. So I always encourage my bass students, when they're using those passing tones or they're emphasizing with the root scoop, it's like choose a destination where that chromatic power really highlights an arrival to like a pillar in the song or a powerful place. Because, for example, like to go to a slightly, different tune for a moment, if you do the same thing over all the things you are for the first 4 bars, the root scoop, it's like you're immediately kind of just you're kind of trashing some of the harmony there as bass players. So it's like knowing maybe I want to use it going from E flat to A flat major, like E flat 7 to A flat major, using that passing tone, or ba 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 bum bum bum, something like that, where you can use. Sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but
that's okay.
Right, because the root scoop
nuance here.
Yeah, the root scoop gives you a chromatic choice and a diatonic choice usually. So it's like if you're going E flat to A7 or A minor 7 flat 5, E flat major to A minor 7 flat 5. This is measure 4 and 5 of Autumn Leaves. You can generally use those half steps and have them all be chord tones, like ba-da, ba-da, bum, bum. You're actually finding the leading tones that are in the key. Or you can go ba-da, ba-da, ba-da. So it's like the total opposite now, like maximum, chromatic crunch. So I always encourage my bass students too to try and find the diatonic solutions first before we start introducing outside note choices. So that way we're really concerned with how we are highlighting those arrivals with the root scoop. You exercise responsibility.
Okay, so just to demonstrate what this would look like on paper, so you could come in with this scoop responsibly from either above, so you could go C to G flat to F, or from below, so it could be F to A to B flat. And notice that's the same as the third of the chord, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of has a double function. Or let's go B flat to E natural to E flat, and and then um, we could keep this G, and again, that'll be the same as the third of the chord. Oh, sorry, no, we're going to A natural. We're not going to keep the G. Let's go to a G sharp, or maybe call it an A flat, leading it. And Danny, one of the things that I've found the longer I've been teaching and the longer I've been playing is that tempo actually matters here. Like in a ballad, if we're playing Autumn Leaves as a ballad, like these are gonna really stand out. Right? Like my voicing no longer sounds good, like on this chord. So I'd have to be really conscientious and conscious of it. Whereas I find like if we're playing this at a nice medium fast tempo, it matters a lot less. And I find that that's true of a lot of dissonances, that if you want to make crazy substitutions at a fast tempo, things just resolve so quickly that it doesn't bother me that much. But in a ballad, you really have to be intentional about it, super clear, because you actually need other people to like move with you. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, tempo definitely matters, and I think, I mean, from what I've seen in teaching bass, is that, um, bass players tend to resolve, or they tend to resort to using more of those chromatic choices just as a function of habit. So that's why my inclination is to always push people towards exploring the diatonic choices first, especially because as you get into playing lines later on, which I know we'll cover, um, there's a lot of I mean, the more chromaticism you use, you have more opportunity to obscure the clarity, or to
Mm.
really enhance arrivals to certain places. So I always say, like, figure out where the stuff lies on a spectrum. Like, what's the absolute clearest you can play, in a ballad, in a medium up tempo, and then like how much power do you have to really obscure some of that clarity too. And again, you're right, totally depends on the tempo and the context. But again, it's all about playing with responsibility.
All right. um, okay, so those are kind of my three go-tos that I teach with a bass line in two. There's certainly a whole art to it and a lot of variation. What do you think is really essential to add? You're talking about diatonic options. Are there more diatonic options? I know, if you're on a chord for multiple measures, it might be nice to kind of do something a little bit more melodic there. What else do we need to add to a bass line in two?
Yeah, so it's really helpful, in a straight ahead context, like talking, playing standards, um,
Mm-hmm.
to like have a certain phrase length that you are broadcasting. So, for example, when I think of playing in two, one of my favorite go tos is Israel Crosby. I think he's phenomenal with the Ahmad Jamal trio, most famously. And so he would do something where he would play 4-bar phrases,
This is great. I'm about
and
to learn
it would
something.
mostly be something like, so it's not too much of that rhythmic emphasis. It's almost like, every 4 bars you get a little hint of the Charleston or something.
Interesting.
Um, but it's just enough to organize it so that way the momentum of the line, it's like it has that resolution point. So that's what I would say is, like, if you're gonna play some type of rhythmic embellishments, I mean, you can also, like, some of the Ron things too, which are cool. But yeah, it's like thinking about how you can organize your phrase, so it has sort of a natural start and end point. Um, and otherwise, no, I mean, really, like, you kind of nailed it. Like, you nailed all the things that I would do if I was teaching in two. So
Cool. Okay,
kudos to
great.
you.
Um, yeah, and a couple tips for pianists looking to kind of get their feet wet with bass lines. Um, just to get the coordination down, you might want to just try repeating the root before you even get into root fifth or root third. So that you can practice clumping. And I do find with a lot of pianists that as they try to play a bass line legato, their comping all of a sudden becomes heavy as well. So it is kind of this patting your head, rubbing your stomach, that you want to play, your left hand's got to stay legato while your comping's going to be mostly still short. One nice thing, and I don't think you'd object to this because I kind of heard you doing it as you played, is that we can put grace notes into our bass lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, try to give it as much personality as we would a melody. And you also heard me use some of these, I call them skip beats. I don't know if that's what you call them.
Yeah,
a name.
exactly.
Are those are legal moves?
Totally legal. And I think that the thing to keep in mind is when I teach those on bass, I always say make the grace notes a lesser velocity than the half note or the quarter note. Whatever the main pulse is, make sure that you're using those grace notes to emphasize or support the arrival, on one of those strong beats.
Yeah. And all those things, they can like really make a big difference. So if I'm just playing literally like root, this is root fifth, some root third, sounds fine. But if I start putting in a little, I'm feeling so much pressure playing a bass line in front of you. Is that all fairly in the right category?
Yeah, and you also did something intuitively, which I love, which is a ba da 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 da. So you're marking the end of that 8-bar section, which is something that bass players need to be very aware of when they're playing in two. Is like, how can we mark those elements of the form? And the scale choice, like ba or ba da 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 da. I'm just playing like to get back into C minor, playing G, F, E flat, D, C. That's really powerful because not only are we playing, like when we're playing in two, we're outlining the harmony in the moment, but we're also broadcasting where we're going by playing that scale. So we're, just really helping with the clarity of the line and adding some rhythmic propulsion in a favorable spot.
Yeah, I love that. There's so much liveliness to a good bass line. It's not just, that you're covering those really basic chord tones and pulses.
Totally.
All right, here's where we're really going to get interesting. Let's talk about walking bass lines and how, what your first steps are. Obviously, this is a lifetime plus of study to like walk a good bass line, right? And so I always kind of feel guilty even approaching teaching it because I'm like, all right, here's my 10 minutes of like what really, is this just immense study of walking a beautiful line. But I'm going to do my best, and I expect to be judged, and I expect to fall flat on my face. And I think there's also a lot of different places that you could start, right? It's not necessarily that there's one direct path there. So if I only have 30 seconds to teach somebody how to walk a bass line, I think the first thing that I would do, like the most universal thing that works and sounds okay and kind of approximates what we want to do, would be to go 1, 2, 3, 1 on every chord. That's not my final answer, but I feel like that's a pretty good place to start. Agree, disagree? So just to sketch out what that would look like, for those of you who are curious, for the C minor, I'd go. Look, this isn't my favorite bass line, but it's easy to finger, it's easy to come up with, and it kind of universally works, no matter what the progression. All right, give it to me straight. Okay, terrible place to start?
No, not at all. I think that's a very solid place to start because you're emphasizing diatonic harmony and not adding passing tones or chromaticism yet. So you get 2 thumbs up for that.
Okay, then you're not gonna like my second thing. So my second thing that I would teach people, is for any time that we're moving in a circle of fifths, a walk up and a walk down. And I teach a walk up, which you're not going to like this because it's got chromaticism in it, right? The walk up I kind of tell people that there's this just kind of standard intervallic formula for, major, minor, dominant. You can go up by a whole step and then 3 half steps to get to the next root if you're moving in the circle of fifths. So just to show everybody at home how that would work, I would go C, D, E flat, E, and then I'd continue up, and I wouldn't actually do this many walk-ups in a row, but just to show everybody. And then I'd go F, G, A flat or G sharp is probably the better choice, but I wrote A flat, A, and then you could keep going up. And this only works if we're moving in the circle of fifths, right? So for any 2-5-1 or anything else, like
Like
this
I Will
progression.
Survive, you have to walk a bass line on that. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But that's like 2 measures. Okay. So you can't always walk up. So the other thing that I teach that you could do when you're moving in the circle of fifths for a 2-5-1 or something like that is a walk down. And I teach that you walk down using the scale of the chord. And so you would just walk down from the root to the next bass note. So I'm going to have to start a little bit higher to make this work for my C minor 7. So I'm going to start C, B flat, A, G. So I'm using C Dorian to walk down, and then F, E flat, D, C. So I feel like you might approve of this one because it is diatonic. And then it'd be B flat, A, G, F, and then I'd get to E flat and I'd be too low and I'd have to do something else. But we could talk about that later. All right, do I get like a B for introducing those two next?
So you get a good score.
Okay.
So again, I think the reason why I teach the sequence differently on bass is because we don't have access to playing chords at the same time, so we don't necessarily get an opportunity to understand the relationship between our note choices and the chord structure. Like we can't hear it at once. So I mean, would it be helpful if I just told you like where I deviate?
Yeah, give me your first 2 steps if you had to, give your first 2 lessons to somebody in 3 minutes.
Okay.
And I'll go ahead and I'll write it down for everybody if you want to, introduce it in that way.
So the first thing that I do, and this actually changed. I used to do a lot of chromaticism in my lines. Like, I can remember the first blues line I learned. And so on, and it works. However, if someone asked me to tell them, like, okay, what are you doing? What are you implying when you play? I wouldn't have an answer for them. I wouldn't know how these notes relate to the harmony. And I also, like, if I heard someone play this, I wouldn't be able to tell them if it was B flat major or B flat minor or E flat 7 or E flat minor.
Fair.
And so, because we don't have access to playing chords at the same time, it's really hard for our ear to pick up on the subtleties of those or to pick up on the implications of those note choices. So I was in a lesson with Larry Grenadier like 7 years ago, and he's like, I want you to play a bass line to an F blues just using chord tones. And I got 4 measures in and I fell on my face and I could not do it. So the first thing that I actually teach bass players to do is play purely diatonic bass lines, just using 1, 3, 5, 7 from each chord. So with Autumn Leaves, for example, so on, just like trying to. It's
Beautiful.
almost like
what a beautiful line.
Do.
Yeah, and I notice you're landing on the third of the chord on the downbeat pretty frequently.
Yeah, and so
I would usually like teach that as a no. Like we really need to hit the root on the downbeat. Am I overreacting?
no, not at all. There should be a distinction made that I would never play that way if we were playing the melody, because then as soon as I hit the third at the same time as a melody, the counterpoint just collapses.
Yeah, especially with that tune, right? Where you're
Yeah.
all yeah, it's gonna be a problem.
Exactly. So this is almost training our ear to be able to outline all of the nuances of the chords and the specific functions, just using the most basic information. Because I think that's a point where bass players lack in their baseline awareness, is knowing everything they're implying. So, I'm still trying to highlight, like you said, the resolutions of the thirds and sevenths. And then I definitely use the roots in a place where you want to add a little bit more gravity to them, or you want like just those pillar moments. Like, where does it need to be? Like, if you didn't play the root, where would the saxophonist look back at you and get annoyed because they're not getting that
Right.
level of support that they need?
Can I try? I'm just curious if I can do your exercise of playing roots, thirds, fifths, and sevenths. And I'm also like thinking to myself, you have such a the way that you are starting to teach has such a clear function for bass players. I wonder if it is the way that piano players should start, or if it's not that essential, because we do have to know the chord in our right hand anyway.
Yeah,
I don't have an answer to that necessarily, but
I'm curious
so
too. Yeah.
you use the sixth there.
You could, yeah, if we were stretching.
Is that kind of the idea of the exercise?
Totally, yeah.
That's fun. I like that. I like trying to find like other connections between those chords. So just to restate for everybody at home, we are only using the root, third, fifth, and seventh of every chord. Maybe the sixth of that last G minor chord. But let me just write out one version of what that would look like. I'll go C, E flat, B flat, G, and then I'll connect that G up to the third of the F7 to A, F, C, E flat, D, B flat, A, F. I'm sorry for my bad singing.
All
G, E flat, B flat, G, something like that. Let me play it for you, Danny. Now you've got me landing on the third an awful lot.
I love it, but you've got such beautiful melodic sequences in there as well. So it's like, by dealing with this basic information, you actually train yourself to find some of those nuts and bolts of great melodic development, and really being aware of the fundamental connections that are already embedded in the chords before adding outside note choices that have more of an impact on the not the integrity of the chord, but just the function of it, right? Like, if you're playing, like if you're playing C minor 7 and then you go to F7, but you play F7 sus to F13, and I just play B natural in there, like that makes your chord sound completely different. So for me, it's like training myself to recognize the nuts and bolts of those sounds also makes me more harmonically aware of what you're doing, which again, you're already harmonically aware of what you're doing, so maybe you don't have to go down that path. But
Interesting. One of the reasons this is actually kind of nice for a pianist is that there's not a lot of crossing under and over like we have to do if we're playing a more scalar bass line. I think one nice thing, so what I would have people do with the walk up, walk down, I'm not advocating for it. I'm just, I would have them practice alternating between the walk up and walk down. And I think this does actually work nicely fingering wise, like I can kind of crawl down the piano without doing a lot of crossing over, which is pretty neat. Or, I could do the opposite, start with a walk down. It's a lot of fingers in a small amount of space. But this also, I can just kind of hang out here. crossover under at all, which is one of the trickiest things fingering wise for us to do in the left hand. So I think that works well, and I can kind of think in these seventh chords in terms of my hand position and just kind of move those down the keyboard while I'm comping, which I think
Yeah.
is really nice too.
This is very cool. Now, the one thing that I heard too is if you're playing rootless voicings in your right hand, um,
Mhm.
then there may be a chance that you're doubling the bass note and the root of your rootless chord. So that also could change the texture and the sound or the function. Again, not a piano player, um, but that also might be something that has to be dealt with somehow.
No, definitely. And one thing that I'm sometimes telling students, if I'm improvising and I'm playing bass in my left hand, I might choose a different bass note based on, pun
Yeah.
intended, what I'm playing. So, if I'm playing Autumn Leaves, I'm hitting a lot of thirds when I play the root in the bass. And by the way, I've seen Kenny Barron do this, and Kenny Barron, I heard him play Confirmation solo, and he's almost always putting the third of the chord. It got to the point where I was like, oh, you're doing an exercise, while you're playing. Like, you're always hitting the thirds. But then if I'm going to change, if I'm going to do something more creative with my bass line,
Yeah.
I can kind of create counterpoint based on what my melody note is landing at the same time as the bass note. That might be different. And then if I'm playing an inversion, I'll try to play like more arpeggios in the right hand so that the chord becomes clear. Because if I choose to start on a B flat for my C minor, it's a weird place to start unless I'm really making that C minor clear, and then it's like, okay, I hear that it's C minor over B.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
I'm kind of finding that root note
Yeah.
when my third's in the bass so that we can still hear the harmony. And I think as pianists, we do have this privilege that you guys, unless you're playing with a written out melody, you guys kind of are going to have to not guess at what the soloist is playing, but you just don't have control over what the soloist is playing, right? Whereas we can be both things at once, and so we can kind of create this interesting counterpoint that you can't. Does that
Yeah.
sound right?
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think that's where, Ron Carter's mastery really comes through too, is like making, like, broadcasting those, I mean, especially when he's playing with Herbie, like broadcasting some of those substitutions or alternative note choices, like starting the first chord of Autumn Leaves on E, right? So treating it as like C over E to E flat minor 6 to B flat over D, like triadic movement, or C minor 7 to C sharp diminished to B flat over D to E flat major to E minor 7 flat 5, and then like stuff like that. There's so much power in some of those simple note choices, which could be, I mean, probably even easier for pianists to be able to get into, because again, you have all the information there right in front of you.
Totally, yeah. I think inversions are very underrated for pianists. We have so much interesting control. Which brings me maybe, as a last point of exploration, I've taken up a lot of your time and I'm so grateful. But I love pedal points. I feel like either I'm completely overusing them or everybody else is underusing them. But I'm such a fan of pedal points. And I think they're such a nice way to create a completely different harmonic world, especially if you're playing multiple choruses of something. Is there a rule of thumb for when you can and can't use pedal points? Before we get into this, if you don't know what I'm talking about with pedal points, that means keeping one bass note even as the chords change. And I think that terminology comes from organs, when you would actually be holding down the pedal to create kind of a bass note. So if I were going to play Autumn Leaves using a pedal point, usually the 5 of the main kind of tonic is what you pedal. Although other things are possible if you're like Ron Carter, and very creative. But I'd play. can, where you can't, how much, anything that we should know?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I at one point in my life, I was accused of using too many pedal points, um,
So
which
we're
I
the
quickly
same.
rejected and kept on using them because they're great. um, so I think the fifth is definitely the fifth of whatever key center you're in is definitely a safe way to go. And I think you can also um, manipulate it a little bit too. Like, so the first step, like what you did for Autumn Leaves is great. And then you can start to maybe find ways to connect some of those pedal points and blur the line. So like, like something like that, where you're getting some of those
Yeah.
crunches in there, adding a little bit of that, and then kind of moving between the two centers. Um,
And you're also doing a hemiola with your pedal point, right? You're playing kind of
exactly.
three
Yeah,
over
I'm
four.
keeping it.
Am I doing it? I think I'm doing it.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, okay. Or the other common pedal thing is to play pedal on 2 and 4, right? Is that considered cheesy by real bassists?
No, no. I think it depends. It totally depends on the context. Like if you're trying to stretch things out, then you'll hear more of the hemiolas. But if you're doing something that's in more of like a bebop or hard bop or swing context, then I think getting too loose with the rhythmic stuff is maybe not the most appropriate choice. Um,
Right.
yeah. So I think in terms of the pedal points, definitely the fifths are, this is the safest thing to do. And I think a good tune like Autumn Leaves is a great tune to practice this on, or something like I Hear a Rhapsody is great. Pedaling five for the entire A section, and then pedaling D and pedaling F, right? It's because you have those solid key centers, but then
Mm-hmm.
there's some moments where there's not really a pedal point opportunity, so you have to figure out how to connect if you want the concept to really be consistent.
Right. Yeah. The pedaling and the inversions can kind of go together, right?
Yeah,
Um, as two kind of sides of a similar coin. I mean, pedal point is kind of a forced inversion. It's just the same note that's creating the inversion for many chords. But what I
totally.
heard you do on Autumn Leaves was you pedaled like the first four measures, and then you kind of went to adjacent notes for inversions.
So even tunes like I know we're stretching it beyond the context of Autumn Leaves.
Sorry, I missed that last
Oh,
part.
sorry. Yeah,
Um,
I talked over you. I'm sorry.
no, you're good.
um, so even something like I'll Remember April, right? Pedal points can be cool because they can fundamentally change the context. Like like C7, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can change the flavor of the harmony just by using a pedal that's maybe slightly different, or like uh like from Coltrane's version
Uh-huh.
where they
For
pedal.
body and soul. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I think the other thing about pedal points, and this is like maybe the most important thing,
Uh-huh.
you just have to have the confidence to do it for like kind of an extended period of time, and just
Mm,
really own it, because other people will find
right.
a way to interact with it for sure.
Yeah. And it can be such a great way to kind of create some energy to bubble up and throw somebody in a slightly maybe different direction in a great way. That's what
Totally.
we want to do in jazz. Is we want to kind of inspire people to think on their feet and play something that they wouldn't play in a normal context.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite again, you brought it up. I love it. Um, Sometimes I'll pedal the root on a blues. Like if we're playing an F blues,
Mm-hmm.
there've been times where I've pedaled F for three or four choruses before unleashing it,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be super cool too. Or um, even sometimes the tritone. I mean, again, it's all kind of a big experiment, right? Like we're seeing what really has a positive impact on the music, and really trying to get creative with it.
Awesome. Well, that feels like a great place to leave it. Danny, if people want to get in touch with you or find you, where should they do that?
Yeah, so DannyZiemann.com is my website, or you can reach out to me, danziemann@gmail.com. I've got a number of books I've written on walking bass, so always happy to connect on this. And I am actually hosting an event July 7th through 9th. It's called the First Call Bassist Intensive. And with this event, the premise is to really teach bass players, although it's open to non-bass players as well, to really get inside their listening abilities, to put that at the core of their musicianship. So how to learn tunes without lead sheets, how to listen to recordings just one or two times and be able to learn tunes. So you really have the confidence and freedom to play anywhere and with anybody. And Jeremy's going to be a guest, giving a really great talk on, diving into jazz piano as a tool for expanding your listening abilities. So super excited to have you there. We're going to have a great time.
Should be great.
Yeah. So otherwise, yeah, if anyone has any, Jeremy, you nailed it, man. This was fantastic. I'm always happy to talk bass lines though with people. So,
okay, we might have to have a follow up. I'm sure I'm going to get off this call and be like, I should ask him like those 10 things. Well, Danny, thank you so much. And I hope to see you soon.
Yeah. And
good luck with all your events and your awesome teaching.
Thank you so much, and you as well. I'm a huge fan of your channel, so I've learned so much getting to watch you just from this. So yeah, thanks for everything you're doing to support the community.
Thanks so much, Danny. See you later.
Take care. Bye bye.